And to know that what you do ultimately might feed that family that lost everything, might support that widow that's sitting alone somewhere in a refugee camp, you can't ask for more job satisfaction.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this series, I'm speaking with sustainable ambassadors about the work they're doing to solve the biggest environmental, social, and economic challenges that we face. For me, this is all about moving from inspiration to action. It's not focused on what's going wrong, but on the people who are doing the work, what they're seeing, and how they measure their own success. And so with that, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Dr. Martin Frick, who's the director of the World Food Program in Berlin. Martin started his career as a German diplomat almost 25 years ago, and from there has held an incredible portfolio of positions as the program director for Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum, and he served as the senior director of the UN Climate Change from 2017, where he oversaw the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Secretariat's climate action work. It's an incredible career, and it's an incredible honor to have you with us. So thank you, Martin, for taking the time.
Thank you, Rich.
So as a starting point, maybe a personal introduction, how you got into the space and the work that you're doing.
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I started off many years ago not knowing what on earth I should be studying. I took literally a last second decision. I remember how I mailed the envelope with the application some seconds before midnight to apply for law. And I loved studying law. I loved the theoretical challenge. But when I came to the close of my studies, I couldn't imagine becoming a lawyer. And so I applied to become a member of the German diplomatic service, and much to my own surprise, I ended up becoming a German diplomat. And then it was a wild journey where in the end, I'm now sort of specialized in climate and food.
And so what is the work that you're doing there at WFP at these days as a director? Like, what is the portfolio? What's the work that you're doing? And how many people are you reaching? What's the impact that you're having?
Right, right. WFP is an organization I need to explain. It's one of the few organizations in the UN system that has a double mandate. We call it Saving Lives, Changing Lives. And saving lives is the classic humanitarian work. You might have seen, white aircrafts dropping parcels with food, with basically everything that moves, ships, trucks, aircraft, helicopter, whatever it takes to reach people in dire need to ensure they're not dying from starvation. On the other side, there is a mandate which we call changing lives, and that looks into the basic conditions of food security and tries to support people in a way they can feed themselves. And so my job here is to basically work with the German government to get money from these two areas of work for the humanitarian aid, but also for building resilience, for helping people to feed themselves.
When it comes to saving lives versus, say, changing lives, what's the balance these days in terms of the two? And is one getting more challenging? Is one you're seeing more progress, or are both kind of growing in terms of urgency and the resources are therefore constrained?
The humanitarian need is staggering. 2019, just before COVID, we estimated that there are some 135 million people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. And those are the people we are looking after. Today, that number is south of 300 million. And so we've never seen a situation in which the gap between the need for humanitarian assistance and the finance was ever bigger. Of course, the one thing is conditioned to the other one. The less we do in building resilience, the more we will see in humanitarian needs. So it's a bit of a catch-22, and I think we need to invest much more aggressively into supporting people to build up their own food security in order to bring the humanitarian need down and really be able to bring humanitarian aid to those situations that classically are in need of humanitarian assistance.
So sorry, what was the numbers again? 130 to 300 million? So basically in 5 years?
135 million by the end of 2019. Today,
Yeah.
more than 300 million, roughly 320 million.
What's behind the growth? I mean, COVID obviously dislodged a lot of people, but are there, like, say, 2 or 3 roots to that problem that are growing and are the largest contributors? or is it like a broad stroke number of challenges that you have to kind of really attack?
I typically quote the three C's, and the biggest C is still conflict. SIPRI, the Swedish Research Institute for Peace, just brought out their new annual report stating that we have 59 live conflicts on the planet right now. That's the highest number we have had since Second World War. And everyone who is, looking at the media, reading a newspaper, is seeing what these crises are. And still, the majority of people are hungry because of conflict. But then there is also the two other C's, and that's costs and climate change. Cost has directly to do with COVID, because when COVID struck, many of the countries, particularly in the global south, were sliding into a very deep debt crisis. And now, what does that mean? That translates into an erosion of the value of money. So on the exchange market, you get less US dollar for your local currency. Then domestically, you got inflation and staple food inflation. And constantly, since COVID and particularly since the attack on Ukraine, prices for staple food are approximately 30% higher than they were before the attack on Ukraine. And if you put all of that together, you see more and more families who basically cannot afford even staple foods. The spooky bit is climate change, because with climate change, we are coming closer to a point where we feel it in the production, where we basically might be reaching soon a point in which indeed food is scarce. And it's not only, in inverted commas, a distribution problem, but it really is a production problem.
But it's also a conflict problem. So it's like it's the multiplier that underpins a lot of these things, right?
These things are interrelated. If you look at the hotspots of climate change, quite often they tend to be also the hotspots of conflicts. They are hotspots for migration. So it's difficult to sort out which is the main driver in those situations, but together they create a toxic mix.
If we don't stay to 1.5, let's say we go 3 degrees or 5 degrees, like how much worse is it, or how much more challenging does it get with, say, every half degree or degree in your view? And are there certain areas that you're really worried about kind of geographically right now?
So climate impacts are with us anywhere, everywhere, all the time. I'm sitting in Europe. I'm still under the impression of these devastating pictures that we have seen from the Valencia region in Spain. We will see more of that. Now, take into that mix the fact that it's only 5 countries who are the main producers of wheat. It's only 2 countries who are the main producers of vegetable oil. What if we see a massive climate-related disaster in one or two of these big producers? And as you said, we are right now, from every indicator, we are saying already above 1.5 degrees. And there's an underlying assumption that climate is just like any other political problem that might go in a linear way in one direction, and then you can steer against it, sort of, balancing inflation versus employment kind of thing. But climate doesn't work like that. There are absolute limits. And when we break these absolute limits, it's like running over a cliff. Then there is no negotiating. Then you will see the full collapse of entire ecosystems. And some of the world leading climate scientists basically tell us we are getting into uncharted territory. We have no idea what's going to happen. And that really scares me.
So it scares you personally. What's it doing at the UN? What's the general sense within your colleagues at the UN, and what's the role that they see themselves playing? Because for many years they've been a negotiator at UNFCCC, but that hasn't necessarily gone well. So what do you think the role of the UN should be now as we're going forward to kind of in this uncharted territory?
I mean, if you read publications from UNEP, for example, UNDP, all of them in unison have no two ways about emphasizing just how serious a crisis that is. Now, you alluded to the climate negotiations, and in a couple of days, we will have the start of the 29th Conference of Parties. But it is what it is. The UN is a club of sovereign countries, and you can only move forward in a very aggressive way if you have a consensus. In these climate negotiations for a long time, we've been trying to balance all sorts of issues, while at the same time, as the former head of the Potsdam Institute put it, you can't negotiate with nature. So I think as a consequence, what that means is wherever there is the option to do climate positive work, we must not wait for a big agreement. In fact, the Paris Agreement is there, the rule book is there, so there is not much less left to negotiate, but there is a world out there of national climate plans that need to be much, much more ambitious in order to stand any chance.
So then what's the future of the platform then? Because if it's not enough and we can't negotiate with nature, it seems to me like there should be an adaptation, iteration, something new that comes through that will allow us to get through that time. And I'm curious, like, where do you see it adapting to this reality or iterating or trying to find a different path when you have so many groups that are for and against the progress?
Let me go some years back. In 2021, I had the privilege to support Agnes Kalibata, the special envoy of the Secretary General, in producing the Food System Summit. And that thing was called Food System Summit just to highlight how big the environmental footprint of our food production is, how much it highlights the social inequalities, how much food systems are a driver of deforestation, water consumption, you name it. It's the biggest everything. It's the short formula. And I'm mentioning that process because we opened the doors wide to all walks of global society. There were independent food system dialogues happening all over the planet. There were governmental-led food systems dialogues. In the central workings of that summit, we had 5 working groups that integrated more than 500 experts. And so you would see a youth activist alongside an ambassador. You would see a senior scientist working together with the religious leaders. And it's that sort of cooperation that we truly need. We need all hands on decks, and we need everything that triggers climate action on every single level. So we need simply everything together, and the UN really still has the convening power to do that.
What are the shifts within the COP process itself, and how, as you open those doors, are you seeing different people? Are they voicing their opinions differently? Are they able to apply pressure differently? Like, because it seemed to be like an old leaders group in the early days. The presidents would fly in, their teams would fly in, but now it's a much larger group of people, and it's not just academics or scientists. It really is activists. It's young and it's old. How has that changed the process or even some of the outcomes?
Well, if you look at the COP process, it is at its very core an intergovernmental negotiation. So the people who really are the actors are very few. In Dubai, you had more than 100,000 people in the conference venue. I reckon that maybe 1,000 of those were government negotiators. And maybe out of this 1,000, well, 24 maybe the really poor people. Everyone else there is an observer, and they're going to the COP because it's the only global meeting ground for climate. And so they go there, but honestly, quite often they return frustrated because they have things to contribute. They bring their enthusiasm, their networks, their knowledge, what have you, and often make the frustrating experience that they can't make it in the conference room, and that in the end, what's coming out in the negotiated text is way below their expectations.
Do you find that even though it's 100, there's 99,000 people outside and there's 1,000 inside, like do those 99,000 people have real influence on the 1,000 and therefore like, look, we need you to act and it's getting hotter than 3 degrees. Like, does that pressure lead to better outcomes?
Well, it does help and it exerts pressure. But when push comes to shove, there's a separate part of the conference venue where the big people meet, where the doors close, and where the negotiations take place. And you won't see activists going there. And even if they were able to go in, these people have instructions. There are very hard interests at stake there. And, it's not that they are coming to a COP and don't really know what to do, and then comes an activist and tells them what to do. There is a reason why they argue as they do, and if things go slow, then certainly there are some parties who have an interest that things go slow.
Are there things that are starting to shake that up and giving you some hope that cracks are forming?
What I see, and it's cynical to say, but it's a reality, is what scientists have been telling us for so long is now hitting home. People see that it's becoming uncomfortable, it's coming closer. And I always said, even 15 years ago, that this will happen necessarily. It will hurt. It will get people into dire situations. For a long time, these were people that, from a perspective of a rich country, seemed far away. But now it's really hitting home. And I can only hope that that mobilization, that understanding really leads to massive political action before we cross tipping points that we cannot undo.
Does it take a massive political shift, or can things be done even at the sub-regional, regional levels that are making real impact towards these goals?
I think there is a lot possible on the local level. And maybe one of the key things that you could achieve when you had action on the local level, maybe even synchronized, is visibility. I think the majority who wants climate action and really is also prepared to change things in order to move forward is often not visible. There is a difference between what we perceive as the public, shouting on social media, and what people really think.
Well, I even think, like right now, the US, China, EU are all fighting over EVs and batteries and solar panels and the things that would, you know, arguably help transition us. Like they're not the solutions themselves, but they help transition us towards a better, less carbon oriented economies. And I'm curious, like, how do we get large actors to set aside competitive forces to find a common goal? Like what, in your experience, like what does it take to do that? And you don't have to speak specifically to this exact challenge, but you must have seen this 1,000 times before. What does it take to get people or organizations who once were like, look, this is my interest, this is your interest, we can't work together, to actually see like there's a shared interest here? Like, what does it take?
Well, I think we are always focusing on our differences and we always neglect the common ground on which we are actually standing. I have a wonderful example from the Food System Summit that I quoted before. One of the hottest dispute where vegans who were basically militantly advocating not to use any animal products, and on the other side, you had grazers who had animals and were basically arguing with a lot of good reasons that if you do animal husbandry in a good way, that it's actually good for the environment. It helps building soils. It helps sequestering carbon. So they were shouting at each other whether you should eat meat or not. And at one point, they came to the realization saying, hey, look, the common enemy here is not us. It's not whether to eat meat or not to eat meat. It's a mass animal industry. It's industrial meat. It's having thousands of animals under abysmal conditions fed by imported grain. That's the problem. And so you have people who fundamentally disagree, philosophically disagree, and yet they were able to identify that actually, they have much more in common. So there were a lot of communalities. And that's why we need to go back and say, well, holding tight to the old business model has brought us where we are now. So there is a common interest to fix it.
Well, and this is where like my frustration with the overall process has been simply that we're tied to like this one global goal or this one global vision for what things to be. It's like, but there's 1,000 contributing factors, systems that we could be attacking equally, And okay, maybe we don't attack all of them today. Maybe we agree on the first 20 or the first 200 and we make progress and then we can figure out what the next group is. But I feel like we're kind of like in this all or nothing scenario right now where
Yeah.
we're just like fighting each other and we're like, look, we can make a little progress together today. We don't have to make all the progress. We don't have to agree on everything, but let's just make that progress and then we'll figure out where we are in the next step.
Absolutely. And exactly there lies an intrinsic weakness of a UN global process because somehow you build a big pyramid and on the top you try to find a solution that works worldwide. Well, the world is a very diverse place. You know, if you're in Iceland, you can heat your house with thermal energy, and that's a wonderful thing. That might not work when you're in Portugal, but in Portugal, you got an incredible amount of wind power. And if you drill further down, you find solutions that are staggering. There is so many smart solutions out there, you know, and it bit of the magic is also in bringing these people to unusual connections. If you're in Sweden and you got one of these lovely holiday houses, odds are you have solar cells and LED lighting. The very same system can help a school in a very poor country to have lighting at night and make it possible for the kids to learn. All of that is possible today. You don't need big legislation. You don't need a big UN summit to actually come into action. But somehow we've come to this situation where everyone is just waiting for regulation to happen. And it's not going to happen.
It's just fascinating, like how these different systems work. And I've talked to corporate and academic, and now, I've talked to the whole spectrum, and everyone's got their role. And I just find it interesting, like how a lot of different silos seem quite stuck at a time when there's so many ways to collaborate together and share best practice and just make a little bit of progress, kind of with each meeting, with each event, with each interaction. But yet, often we just kind of we hold back a little bit.
And so often in government structures, you have good people wanting the right thing, and then they create something that makes sense in their world, but from another perspective doesn't make sense at all. The more I think about these things, the more I'm fascinated what I call tacit assumptions. So people discuss, but they discuss on the basis of assumptions that they are not even aware of. And this is where the magic is. Give you an example. I'm German, as you can clearly hear. In that country, we believe that every house, every family needs to have 8 kilowatts of electricity any given time. Why? Why do I need to put on my air conditioning, my dishwasher, and my washing machine at the same time? If you just think on this question of why, you could maybe reduce the energy that is available for every German household to 4 kilowatts. And I think this is where the magic is happening when we basically question ourselves what I see as a problem, is it really that? Or am I phrasing the problem in the wrong way? And that is when the magic is happening.
Speaking of magic, I want to talk a little about your career and your career journey. What is the magic of the UN system that has kept you going through different careers, different portfolios for the last 25 years? I mean, it's a slow moving glacier. It doesn't necessarily always have the greatest outcomes. There's a lot of pressure in the job. There must be some magic somewhere. What is it? What keeps you going through this cycle and through these positions to achieve the greater goals?
I mean, it's incredibly difficult to come to a consensus. I once told my mom, it's like you're going to a pizzeria and you can only order one pizza. And then every group says, well, you know, I can't have salt because I have high blood pressure. I can't have mozzarella. You know, I'm lactose intolerant or what have you. And in the end, when you find a tasteless piece of bread, you still celebrate your diplomatic victory because everybody can live with it. But seriously, when you have this moment that everyone agrees and the gavel comes down, it's unbelievable. And one of my most emotional moments was years ago, the UN Convention for the Right of People with Disabilities. We negotiated over weeks, most intensively, not only as it is with 197, I think at the time, member states, but we had representatives from every group with about every disability that you can imagine. Deaf people, blind people, people in wheelchairs, people with, disabilities you have never seen before. And you work together day and night and day and night for weeks. And when then finally the gavel came down and we really had a breakthrough that made a difference, or is continued to making a difference in the lives of hundreds of millions of people, that is something that only the UN can do. And then, it's worthwhile all these nights in windowless conference rooms and lukewarm coffee and all the things that go with it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you stay motivated in the face of the complex challenges, but it seems like are you able to, is it a matter of reflecting backwards, or is it also a matter of having a vision for what's possible should you make that breakthrough?
The standard sentence with the UN is, if you wouldn't have the UN, you would have to invent it. And every ever so boring conference, every endless night in a conference room, heaven knows is better than people shooting at each other. And that's basically what the UN is. It's the attempt of all of humanity to fix our problems in a civilized manner without killing each other. And looking forward, everything you need to fix the world's problem is there. The wireframe is there. The program needs to adapt to that. The UN is everything when there is political will, and it's nothing if this political will is missing. And so to know that we could overnight fix climate, we could overnight fix the biodiversity loss, we could be very meaningful in fighting pandemics and all of that, is something that you need to keep up. And in my work with the World Food Program, it's just knowing. I mean, I'm sitting comfortably in a G7 capital city, but most of my colleagues sitting in the places where people need them most. And to know that what you do ultimately might feed that family that lost everything, might support that widow that's sitting alone somewhere in a refugee camp. Well, you can't ask for more job satisfaction.
All right, switching for our last topic, which is really kind of like young professionals and the youth engagement. What's the role of the youth now? I'm seeing a lot of activists who are very young. My son is 13. He's very aware of the challenges. What's the role of the youth? And as boomers are retiring and Gen X is taking leadership, and as millennials are coming in, like, how does that change the potential for action? And how does that change just the general environment for the work that's being done?
I think there is a lot of angst with young people. Maybe is something that our generation doesn't fully understand and can't understand how it actually is to grow up with climate change. These kids, they haven't seen anything, they haven't learned anything that whatever beautiful documentary you see in TV about, a beautiful place here and there, it always comes with, and it's endangered, and the biodiversity is lost, and climate change is doing that. Where we need to empower the young people and really, really ask them for better ways of cooperating. And that's what I see with young people, that there is a certain age in which collaboration becomes natural, and building up boundaries and negotiation positions and second thoughts seems all like scheming. And then it changes over time. And we are losing something extremely precious if we compromise. On the other side, I mean, they are all hyper connected. It seems like digital devices are a body part for young people. And I guess it's this generation more difficult in a very positive way to emphasize on differences when they see TikTok videos posted by kids on the other side of the planet, and they do what they do and they find funny what they find funny. And so that global spirit of cooperation maybe is coming more from that side, because it seems random to build up barriers and say, here's my container of national sovereignty and here's yours, and I'm thinking I can have a 2% edge over you, and therefore I'm ready to risk everything. It just doesn't make sense.
So actually, on that last point that you're making about the peer-to-peer connections, and they're finding, relationships or commonality globally now. Does that mean that the movements are better coordinated? They're able to exert more pressure, they're having more impact, or are they still falling into the same challenges as an activist that had a small group in one part of the world?
It's tricky. And what you see is you have 10,000s of groups and NGOs and individuals and what have you. Often a petition is the only end game of a big campaign. And then we know how often these petitions end up in nothing. So we need to combine the practical action, the practical step, something that people do right away with the political oomph. And what I see with young people today is it's less that you're joining a big NGO and you get the newsletter and you pay your membership fee. That doesn't resonate with this generation. But what does resonate, if you say, well, this Saturday afternoon from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., can you help doing this? And then they're happy to contribute, but then comes the next thing.
What are some of the things that you've learned through your own work or seen works at the UN that others could learn from? Not that if it, like it's prescriptive, but what are some things that from a big platform that if you're going to build a youth movement that had sustaining power, that had global impact, what are a few things you'd impart on the leaders for that?
Yeah, I think a key word is subsidiarity, that you're basically going down to the level where an actual problem can be solved. And sometimes that's a very local problem. Sometimes that's a regional problem, like all the people who live along a river can work together to get this river clean. Sometimes it's a global issue, but you need to have the flexibility that you always work towards one specific goal and then you work backwards. How, in order to fix that, what do I need to do? And what I see ever so often is people build something new and then they say, oh, we need a governance structure. And the next 3 years, you don't hear from this group because they are so terribly busy building a governance structure when they could actually hit home specific wins already.
Now, it's fascinating because actually I was thinking like, how do you create structure within an organization so you have those, but at the same time, decentralization done the right way is much faster. It's just a matter, but it's also a matter of like quality control, but also I find ego comes in as well. Like who in the governance structure is at the top, who's in the middle, who's at the bottom, who can call the shots around the board table. Like I think we fall into those similar traps, but maybe through social media and growing up distributed, we can avoid some of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, social media is interesting because in the old days, if we had spoken in the 90s, I would have said we need rock stars. We need, this big name and that big name, and then we create a big concert and we have all the people in the world. We have a world in which there are, the famous influences, but then there are also micro groups, and they have maybe 5,000 followers. And you got a much more fragmented system in which specific people are watched on social media because they know something and they share their knowledge. And in this fragmentation, there is also a fascination because it's relevant. And if you get into these little systems, you can actually change things.
As a final question, tying together the idea of a little group of people having influence and tying like kind of bringing it all together, what are some pieces of advice you give to someone who really sees the UN as their future, like they want to build a career in this organization across, and basically leverage the tools of it? What should they know going into it? What are some things they should learn along the way, and what's the potential for impact?
What I would give as advice is the UN is a club of sovereign countries, and very often in the countries in which you live, there is increasingly a potential for young people to be engaged, to be youth delegates, to be heard, to have consultations. And I would use that. I would work with my government. I would join people because they want to have committed young people. and it gives you a fast track into these negotiation tracks.
Education background, languages, travel, field work. Is there anything that would help them get a little bit further along in the career, or is it just, start young, pay attention, find the right mentors internally, and just kind of keep plugging away at it?
I think what's always good to see, and I'm an employer, I sometimes am in the position to employ young people. I always look for, is that person engaged somewhere? And it can be anything. It can be your church parish, it can be an environmental NGO, it can be an organization that helps homeless people, whatever it is. But it's good to see if somebody also works with and for the community in any sort of sense. It's a good personal experience. It's also a key qualification to work for such an organization. And, empathy. I think empathy is the most important thing, that you look at other people who talk differently, eat differently, behave differently, and you try to understand and to open up. And that, in the end, what the organization is trying to do as well.